All right, this screencast is meant to help you as you complete the notes on some of the additional widgets and features of GUI programs, such as text and entry boxes, check buttons, radio buttons, and the grid layout manager. So the programs you're completing are Movie Chooser and Movie Chooser 2. Those are the two I'm going to show you here. And there's a couple different versions of Movie Chooser 2, one without a submit button, one with a submit button. But let's look at just the Movie Chooser program first. And what I want to look at here is some of the new stuff. So I'm going to skip over a lot of the class that you should be familiar with already and go immediately first to the text box that you're using for this program. This is where you're going to display the results, right, depending on what movie is chosen. So in this case, we're creating a text field, and there are some specific options that you can set up for this. Use the GUI documentation to learn about all the different options you might want to include for a text field. And also important to note that you're learning about the layout manager, so how you can arrange the widgets in your GUI program. And we're using the grid layout manager. There are others, but the examples we use are all using grid. Right? So you can explore the others at your own leisure. Grid uses a grid system, as the name implies, to lay things out in rows and columns, kind of like a spreadsheet would. And there are some options for this as well that you can look up in the documentation. And here's one example of that column span, right? If you want your widget to span multiple columns in the grid. This will be a little confusing when you first start using it. And the more widgets you add, I think the more sense it starts to make. When you just have like one or two widgets on there, it can be kind of confusing because there's not much to orient yourself with, like what the grid is, right? You can't see the grid, so that's confusing too. Another thing that can be confusing with grid is when you call this method, nothing returns from it. So be careful where you call it, right? So be careful where you call it because you could end up saving nothing back, and then that could result in potential errors. So that's the text field. When you run this program, right, the text field is going to be at the bottom. And then for this particular one, when you click checkboxes, the text shows up in the text field. So that's the behavior of this particular program. So obviously another new thing there is this idea of a check button. So I want to show you that. Show you one example of that here. This creates the check button. In order to use a check button, we need to create an object known as a Boolean var, Boolean variable. And you can see I store that here in an attribute. And then that attribute gets assigned to the variable option for your check button. Essentially what happens there is it allows you to check the variable of the check button to see whether or not the check button is checked. Because eventually you're going to want to know when you go to display the text whether or not this check button is checked. All right, and when you, we'll look at the event handler here to see what I mean by that. When you look at a check button, you get method to get its value. It returns if the Boolean var is true, it's going to or I'm sorry, if this will return the value of the Boolean var, true or false, right? So if true, then you add this to the string that you're going to display as part of the text box. And this is a good time to point out with the text box as well that you're going to be writing information into it. And the way you do that is using the insert method. And before you insert it, it's a good idea if you don't want to keep the previous value, you want to delete whatever's in there. So you can see there's some values that basically mean delete the entire contents of my text box and then insert some content starting at the beginning of the text box. So that's essentially how you use the Boolean var variable. You can also see in this particular program, the text field gets updated immediately when you check the checkbox. All right, and that's because each individual checkbox has a event handler tied to it. Right, so when you check or uncheck it, the event handler runs. That's another important thing to note. Oh, and another important thing to note is that the Boolean var, right, since each checkbox behaves independently, you need a Boolean var object for every checkbox button checkbox you create. That's the first program. The next one is looking at radio buttons. Right, so this one, yep, I need to update my main. So go and do that. So this is movie chooser 2, no submit button. All right, so here you're going to see an example of radio buttons. And the difference between a check and a radio is that a radio button will not stay checked if you check another, right? So they're all kind of tied together. Only one can be active at any given point in time. Right? And then your text field, again, updates when you make the selection. Let's see how that works. So for a radio button, since they're all tied together, you create a string var this time, right? And there's different, there's Boolean var, there's string var, there's other different variables, right? It depends on what you're going to have. So for a checkbox, a Boolean var makes sense because it's either checked or not, it's true or false. For radio buttons, we want a string var because we want the value of one particular radio button when it's selected. So you can see we create the string var object here. And then we immediately set it to be none. This is just a nice thing to do because it'll make the output a little nicer. Right? It'll still work even if you don't have this. But then when you create the radio buttons, you are going to assign again your string var variable, self.favorite in this case, to be the variable for the radio button. You do that for every radio button. So you can see the variable is the same for all of them, which essentially ties them together and makes them a series of radio buttons. Right? Without that, they'll behave independently. So that's really important. And then when you get the value of this string var variable, right, this favorite, it's going to return you whatever one is currently selected, and it gives you back the value, right, of the radio button. So you can see the value for these are different depending on what's selected. Drama and romance. So there's 3 different options. If I show you the GUI again, you see that. And when I select a radio button, the event handler is again tied to the button just like it was for the check, so immediately the text field gets updated when I select one. Right? By getting the value of the string var, it returns me whatever value radio button is selected. You can see that in the event handler here. Similarly, you just basically get, right, from that string var variable, self.favorite, and it retrieves the appropriate value we need for our message. All right, the last one I want to show you is the movie chooser with a submit button. So in this case, our event handler will not be tied to the button. So you can see nothing happens if I select a button, but instead the event handler is tied to the actual clicking of submit. So when I submit, then the text box gets updated. And I can change my option and resubmit. So this is going to be very similar. Right, to the other one, except for your event handler, instead of being tied to the radio buttons, is tied to the submit button. Right, And that's really the only difference. Then you're going to write the event handler the exact same way, right? So those are the examples to look at. You can look at and one other thing to note is with this grid layout manager here, there is this option of sticky that you might want to explore, and it takes in like the cardinal directions, like north, south, east, and west. There's some others as well that you can use, so you can look that up. But that will basically, in the given cell that it's assigned to, it'll move it around that cell even, so you can have it left aligned or right aligned. So that's another thing to note. But that's about all I wanted to show you. So good luck completing these, and just let me know if you need any help.